So, uh, today, good morning. Good morning. It's great for those of you that are watching today from class this semester. Y'all know today is like biblically flooded outside. Um, and I guess for my great grandchildren who may watch this one day, it's class will be a little different today. Oh. Thank y'all for coming. Sorry that it had to be under these conditions. I drive like a little small car, so like all the big trucks are like right on top of me. Like, come on, dude. Go as fast as I can, Captain. All right, enough of that. So before we get into the specific muscles, let's talk a little bit about structure, the difference between the shoulder joint and the hip joint, ball and socket. So they're both the same classification of joints, ball and sockets, but obviously they're different types. The socket is still there. Some people say, well, it's not a true socket. A golf tee is a socket. It's just maybe not a deep socket, but it's still a shallow socket. So the socket's still there. It's just very shallow, and that's again to create a lot more motion. At the hip, the humerus, sorry, the femur, got it up there. So at the socket of the femur, where the femur articulates with the acetabulum, it's literally a bone-on-bone contact. Obviously, there's fluid and there's hyaline cartilage. But the point is that when you lift your leg up, your muscles are pulling up, but the socket is pushing the head of the femur down. That's how you create a force couple. Two different linear forces that are trying to spin the same thing. No different than you're at a merry-go-round, you're pushing kids on the merry-go-round. It's better if one adult is on one side and the other adult's on the other side. I'm pulling this way, they're pulling that way, but we're both trying to rotate the same way. Okay? So muscles are pulling up, but something is pushing or driving the femoral head down to create this force couple. At the shoulder, we don't have force of contact. You have space up here, and that extra space is provided for extra motion. So in the ball and socket of the shoulder, the part of the acetabulum, the socket, is kind of not there. So if you have like deltoids and other big muscles that are trying to bring the arm up, what's to prevent the humerus from going up here? And that's the essence of the rotator cuff muscles that we're going to talk about today. How you have muscles in front, on the back, that are trying to pull the humeral head down. So instead of the socket of the hip pushing the femoral head down, for normal functioning shoulders, you can have muscles that are tugging the humeral head down while you bring your arm up. And if those muscles don't do their job appropriately or they're fatigable, then your humeral head will actually shift up and the acromion will actually push it down. And the problem with that is you can have muscles that live in here. Has anybody ever heard of like impingement syndrome, rotator cuff? A lot of times it's because those muscles aren't doing their job, keeping the golf ball on the golf tee. And so as you are doing overhead stuff, that humerus is translating up and this bone is pushing it down. But there's stuff that lives in there. So it's getting pinched and grinded on. Okay. So I wanted to give that purpose of the rotator cuff before we got into the specific rotator cuff muscles. Okay. Now, the rotator cuff muscles do have purpose and function of joint motion. However, as I've said many times, muscles don't always just influence motion. They help with stability as well, right? Joint stability, joint integrity. Here are, good Lord, look at that graduating class. Here are all of your muscles and functions in list form. I also have the abbreviations there. Remember, the abbreviations work because if we had to write all those names of muscles, it would take up even more of the circles. So the abbreviations are just to help easier for us to fit everything in there. Subscap is a rotator cuff, teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus. So your first four are your rotators. I'm going to get into those today. Your deltoid. So your deltoid is one muscle, but it has different parts, just like a fan-shaped muscle, like anterior fibers, the gluteus medius minimus. Upper chest is the same thing. So the deltoid itself is one muscle, and then they have different parts of it that have different holes. All of the fibers have something common, but different fibers can have different holes and different lanes. Biceps brachii shorts, overcoat. I always like to start off with just kind of showing you just, if we looked at everything holistically, like, I think this is a good example. You see that muscle called teres major? Teres major. So you look at that muscle and you're like, oh, it's another one of our back muscles. But that muscle actually crosses the shoulder in the front, and it's actually an internal rotation. So just giving you an example why we don't want to just visualize sometimes. Some of them work, some of them are very obvious, but not all of them. Not all of them. That's why we try to give it one by one and look at how it falls. All right. Let's start off with our rotator cuff. So again, these are four individual muscles who cover all of our bases. That's how I like to look at it. An infield is going to have a third base, second base, a first base, and a shortstop, covering all the bases. What about home plate? Well, that's not a base. I'm joking, but it's a baseball joke. So we're going to cover all of our bases. And again, the purpose is to encapsulate the humerus with muscularity, because we don't have the same protections that we have in the hip, because we're trading off some of that stability for mobility. Okay? So these rotator cuff muscles independently have function of motion pull, but collectively they all have something in common, and that's to draw the humeral head onto the socket, a little shallow golf tee. Keep the golf ball on the golf tee. For my football enthusiasts out there, have y'all ever seen a kickoff where the wind is blowing too hard and it keeps blowing the ball off the tee, and so another player has to hold it? Very simple. So, you know, you have natural motions that where that golf ball may look off that golf tee. And so we have extra protection in there muscularly to try to maintain that articulation. Okay. We have, this is an anterior view. So one of our bases is going to be covered in the front, drawing the humeral head down and in. We have our double play combination back here. We have two muscles that cross posteriorly to draw that humeral head, and then we have one over the top that's kind of pulling it in. Okay. So the anterior one, I'm going to teach you guys in a little bit, the subscapularis. Crosses, inserts, and it's an internal rotation puller. We're going to get into the specifics. I'm just trying to show you how they can all work together. The infraspinatus, teres minor are lateral crossings, so they're external rotation pullers. So again, if you think about it, if you had a ball, you see these little blue, those are the insertions of them. So we're covering all of our bases. So when you have an internal rotation puller working with external rotation pullers, they can cancel out each other's spin and work together to try to draw the humeral head down there. Does that make sense? And then the one over the top is an abduction puller, but it's also trying to keep the humeral head. It's trying to prevent golf ball. Another fascinating, so all of these, like Has anybody ever heard of like the bicipital groove? You've heard that term before? It's this little, like little trench that the biceps break out, long head cross into. This groove is formed by like the mountain ranges that these muscles pull on. So what I mean by that is you have the subscapularis, you have one rotator cuff muscle yanking on this bone, and gradually more bone will be laid off to give it more of a mechanical advantage to pull. And then you have these laterals pulling laterally, doing the same thing. And so these little condyles, these little extra bone formations naturally, evolve over time. And it creates this little groove that the bicep kind of fits into. So again, the rotator cuff muscle exists to try to help maintain joint stability in a purpose of extreme mobility. There's trade-offs. Everything's about trade-offs. In order to have all this mobility, we have to sacrifice some stability. So here are your 4 rotator cuff muscles. Your subscap, I'm going to try to give you, so I have context here. So this is a view, an anterior view, and you can see your subscapularis, which I like that name because literally like subtalar, subscap underneath the scapula. So if you see inside the scapula, you see that red part? That's the origin of the subscapularis. I like to think of the scapula as a piece of bread and the ribs are a piece of bread and the subscapularis muscle is like a piece of deli meat in your sandwich, like that comes from it, okay? So the subscapularis comes out from the scapula, crosses the shoulder anterior. So what that means is, it shows you the origin of the subscap. It comes from the scapula, from the posterior, but it crosses in the front. So that means when it pulls, it's pulling in the direction of internal rotation. Does that make sense? It's an internal rotation puller because of how it crosses. Even though the muscle starts kind of in the back, to get to its insertion, it crosses in the front. Make sense? Okay. There's subscapularis is this one. So this view takes out all the ribs and all the kind of distraction. But I just want to show you what it was relative to the other bones in the other places. And then we'll get that out and then say, hey, here it is. So again, 2-dimensional pictures are hard to see 3-dimensional concepts. This one looks flat, but it's not. It's coming from the posterior to the anterior. Does that make sense? And so when it pulls, it's going to pull in the direction of internal rotation. The internal rotator of the subscap, now this is a pretty big muscle, right? I mean, look at big muscle in terms of coverage area. Here we have kind of this this wall for you Game of Thrones fans out there. The spine of the scapula kind of creates this wall. So we have muscles that originate, that have a good surface area to originate underneath the spine. Well, infraspinatus, inferior to the spine. That's where that muscle gets its name. And then on top of it is supraspinatus, superior to the spine of the scapula. Okay. So it kind of makes sense, like infraspinatus, teres minor is the other rotator cuff muscle, the double plate combination. But the subscapularis has more coverage area. Subscapularis is also tighter. It tends to be more fatigue resistant and has more tone. It's like the plantar flexors being tighter than dorsiflexors. So it kind of makes sense where you kind of need 2 to work with, one that's kind of bigger and tighter. But again, the external rotators of the infra and the teres are pulling with the subscap to try to draw the humeral head down and in while you're doing overhead stuff. Internal rotator being canceled out by lateral external rotator, but all of them working together to translate. Muscles can translate. talk about those components. All right, the supraspinatus. This is the muscle that's going to be involved in impingement syndrome, rotator cuff syndrome, where there's just a inflammation, irritability with overhand motion. This is usually the one that's gets ticked off. And it makes sense. It's literally passing through. So the supraspinatus, you see that red part on the top of the spine, that's where that muscle kind of originates from, and it literally passes through this tunnel and inserts onto the humerus on this little notch right there. So this muscle is an abduction puller. This is how it crosses. So in other words, it crosses the shoulder laterally. See how if it pulls, this would be an abduction puller, but it's still trying to draw the humeral head in. So we're literally encapsulating the humerus posteriorly, medially, and superiorly. And maintain position. Right? Where this muscle gets ticked off is when the infra and teres and the subscap are fatigable, not doing their job to maintain the golf ball and the golf tee. And so when you do overhead stuff, your humerus will translate superiorly and start pinching off on the muscle that lives in between the two bones. And I always got to refer to Dr. Bob Macklin. I mean, what a great teacher. So Dr. Bob was the medical doctor. He was a medical ortho that I did my fellowship with at the Houston Clinic in Auburn. And he would just use really great analogies. He said one of the analogies was the paperclip analogy, where you take a paperclip and you bend it again. But as you bend it, it'll start to get fatigable and then it'll break, right? After several bends. He also used a paper analogy where he said if you compress, your fingers in between a piece of paper and you start compressing and pinching and kind of twisting, he's like, eventually that paper will wear away and it'll fatigue out and it'll tear. So his analogy is when you don't have normal orthokinematics in your shoulder, his fancy word for it, and the shoulder is translating up, you're pinching that muscle, and if you're doing a lot of overhead, that compression and twisting eventually may tear a piece of it off. And your body has ways of telling you, hey, what we're doing isn't good right now. That's right. It'll get inflamed, it'll hurt, it'll basically say, hey, I'm not very happy right now. The problem is, one of the issues is that for especially occupational workers, they feel they have to keep working. I mean, you got work to get paid, and so they'll battle through it. They may take pain medication to battle through it. This could be athletes too, okay? So again, like the paper is starting to fatigue, and the paper represents the muscle, the supraspinatus. Paper starting to fatigue. It's telling you it's irritated. It's telling you it's getting pissed off. But if you subvert that messaging with pain meds, eventually it may tear. So pain is a good thing sometimes. I mean, I'm not saying all the time, but pain is our body's way of trying to tell us something. So that can happen with the supraspinatus. There was one more thing I wanted to say about. Oh yeah, Dr. Bob used to use this other analogy. He said he would say if he was trying to emphasize cumulative chronic pain. He said if I tapped on you, you feel it and it might be annoying, but it doesn't hurt. But he said if I tapped on you for an hour, if I tapped on you for 2 hours, he's like eventually there's going to be a bruise there. Like eventually it's going to hurt. And so like, it's a continuum, like which tap produced pain? Like And so for a lot of these chronic overuse things, that's kind of how we have to think of it. It's not necessarily it was one tap. It wasn't like it was one movement. It's just the sum total of a lot of movements when everything's not in its right place. Okay. In addition, acutely, a lot of times, the rotator cuff is injured posteriorly. These guys with the double plate combo in the back. Because these are lateral, because they're external rotation pullers, when pitchers or throwers are speeding up internal rotation, those muscles are going to help slow down internal rotation eccentrically. And so those posterior crossing rotator cuff muscles might pop or tear, being brakes, trying to break internal rotation. One thing we're going to learn, I told you we're going to be patient in the shoulder. It's a lot. You have a lot of internal rotation pulls, some big hosses. Pecs, lats, big, powerful internal rotators. And it should make sense because for us, functionally, not now because we could just go to Rouse's and eat whatever we want, but for our ancestors who had to use ladle ladles and try to take care of food from a distance if they, couldn't, gather for, you had to kill animals. You didn't want to go up to the end. Killing from a distance for our ancestors was a big deal. Like being able to throw something like a spear or a javelin. So when we evolved the ability to internally rotate to create speed of our hand, we need more gas muscles. Like we need more muscles that are trying to make our car go fast. Does that make sense? So we need powerful internal rotators to speed up, and then we'll worry about putting on the brakes secondary. It was more important to have as much speed as we could for our distal segment to put food on the table. And so we don't have as much investment in the slowing down portion. Because we put a lot of our stock into actually speeding up the hand motion, not slowing down. All right, so in summary, our 4 rotator cuff muscles: subscapularis, internal rotator; infraspinatus, so we have the spine of the scapula in the back; inferior to it, infraspinatus, is a lateral rotator; teres minor is a lateral rotator, double plate combination. On top of the spine, supraspinatus, covering the top base; abduction puller, but really it's just more than that, it's encapsulating the top part to draw it in. Again, this is a bad day. So we're trying to have things that are trying to make sure we keep that golf ball secure onto the socket, onto the golf tee. Okay. I'm going to jump ahead to the biceps brachii long head because some clinicians will refer to that as the 5th rotator cuff muscle, even though it's not. It's just fun to say. So the biceps brachii long head has I say the same, but very similar crossing as the supraspinatus. In fact, you see that little bony notch, almost like the humerus's greater trochanter. It's not, but it's just a version of it. So that's where the supraspinatus ends. The biceps brachii long head starts darn near where the spinatus ends. So you see this little red dot right there? So it starts here and then crosses laterally on the shoulder. So it's anterolateral crossing. What commonly happens, now this muscle, there's a lot of cool things about the biceps brachii long head, but this muscle actually inserts into the suction cup that's called a labrum. You ever heard of a labrum tear in the shoulder? So the biceps brachii long head literally is part of the labrum. So when you hear a torn labrum, it's really a biceps brachii long head yanking out a piece of suction cup on the shoulder. This muscle is really cool because since it has the same function as the supraspinatus based off of how it crosses, not only will it have the same or similar motion pull, but it has the same stability component, trying to keep the humeral head into the socket by crossing anterolateral. So if we're doing overhead stuff and my shoulder is translating a little bit up and it's pinching on my supraspinatus and my supraspinatus is getting irritated and it's hurting, it makes sense that another muscle could say, well, I'm going to do a little bit more to try to help you out. Think of it like this. We all have our own problems. You know, life's tough, busy, we have responsibilities. But if you ever have a friend or a family member that's going through a really, really tough time, you may offer to, you know, do some extra stuff for them. Well, that adds to your plate. And so it's very kind of similar, where if the supraspinatus is impinged or irritated or hurt, the biceps brachii is like, well, I have a similar function, so I'm just going to do more to help you out. But then guess who ends up getting hurt themselves? Biceps brachii long head. So biceps tendonitis, that kind of stuff is all kind of related to each other. So bicep is not a bad one to talk about, because we've already mentioned it at the elbow and the radial ulnar joint. Think about two-headed bicep, two-headed muscle, but both of those heads cross the shoulder. The short head crosses and attaches to this. I don't remember what this was called in anatomy, the coracoid process, and a little hook of the scapula. This is part of the scapula. So the short head goes here. So it crosses the shoulder anteriorly. You can imagine it's going to be a flexion puller and not be your biggest one, but it's there. And then the long head is more anterolateral. So in other words, it still has an anterior crossing, but instead of kind of purely in the front, it's more like front side. So it's going to have an abduction and a flexion pull. Okay. So transitioning to link tension, if you were trying to increase the contribution of the biceps brachii as an elbow flexor, you want to extend the shoulder, stretch it out so that it pulls more on the other way, right? If you want to slack it, not to say you don't work it, but you know, you can emphasize other muscles with the radial ulnar joint position, but also if you flex, you'll slack it on there, contribute a little less. Again, it's not to say it's off, but I think that's why that brachialis is so, brachialis is like, do you ever remember that honey badger video when Tyrann Mathieu became famous? The honey badger takes what he wants. That's brachialis. Brachialis. It's just such a powerful elbow flexor. Because all it cares about is pulling in the direction of elbow flexion. So we could just really yoink it. Very underrated muscle, brachialis. So there's the short head crossing anteriorly. There's the long head. It's just an artist sketch, but the long head crossing your anterolateral. There's that picture. Anterior, anterolateral, but both crossing the shoulder. So you can see how if you look at my cursor, so the supraspinatus would pass through this tunnel and insert there. And the long head of the bicep starts here and then almost kind of continues the path down. All right, let's go to our circle. Teres infraspinatus, teres minor, lateral rotatus, subscapularis, medial or internal rotatus, supraspinatus, abductor. That makes sense? From a circle standpoint. Biceps brachii long head, anterolateral, So the anterior part is a flexion forward, the lateral part is an abduction forward. Biceps brachii head is a flexion forward. Anterior. Cool. Make sure it matches up with your functions. Subscapularis, internal rotator, teres minor, external rotator, infraspinatus, external rotator, supraspinatus, abductor. Biceps brachii long head, flexor abductor, short head, flexor. Let's go to our PowerPoint. So your supraspinatus, and this is on Google if you want it. If you can't see this very well, that's okay. Pull it up on your device. I just want to remind you that wall is your spine and your scapula. I love it because it's a good dividing point. What's on top, what's on the bottom. So we know we're looking at the supraspinatus because it's on top of the scapular spine. I love also how they make the spine and the acromion invisible so that you can kind of see what's happening inside. Does that make sense? Because again, it's kind of happening in a tunnel there. So I love how it's like infra. Does that make sense that like these muscles couldn't maintain as much stability if they inserted like more on the neck? Like, you know, like it's literally the fact that they're more on the ball. Now, you don't have that in your hip. You don't need that in your hip. You have a big ligament inside. You have this big socket. But when you don't have those things in the shoulder, you literally need muscles that are yanking just on the ball itself to try to help with your maintain ball and order shoulder still. Subscapularis, pulls. So again, even though that muscle starts in the back, it crosses the front, and that's why it's an internal rotation forward. Does that make sense? I know some people really like the videos. Helps to teres minor. Major, say if I get a bicep for this, the delta of these. We got this. You guys remember in 310 we talked about like frontal sagittal, but what do we call something like here? Well, it's just a combination. It's some frontal happening with some sagittal. That's right. It's not like it's an independent plane. It's a combination. It's like traveling northeast. You're going northeast, but some of it is north, some of it is east, and when they happen together, you have northeast. So when we say the bicep is anterolateral, it crosses some in the front, some lateral. And so the lateral component, that's why it's it has an abduction component and it has a flexion component. I think it's no different than precedent, like the tibialis anterior is a dorsi invert. You know, it has a combination of pulls. There's the lateral. So in reality, the biceps brachii long head would pull like if there was no external forces and it was the only muscle in the body and I was magically able to turn it on, it would like want to do like this. Does that make sense? Like it would want to do, some of it would want to do this and some of it want to do that. And when it does it together, it would come out to the side. Only talking about rotators, okay? Okay. I want to talk about rotators, okay? Nothing. No, it's up crowd. That was a good impression. Is it Mr. Mackey? Subscap or infraspinatus in Terry's mind? Don't answer it out loud, get some thought. And yes, you overachieving students, I know the supraspinatus would be working isometrically to hold this position. But in terms of the exercise, would I be working lateral or external rotators or medial or internal rotators? Let's identify the group. What's that rubber band trying to do to my shoulder? It's trying to internally rotate me. So I would need lateral or external rotators. Infraspinatus territory. Subscap or infraspinatus teres mild? Some thought, I'll answer it right away. Do I need my medials or do I need my laterals? Okay, what is the cable trying to do to my shoulder? Is it trying to internally rotate me or externally rotate? Yeah, so I need my laterals, right? I did a double switchy on you. I did basically the same exercise, right? Okay, so let's practice contraction. If I know that I need lateral rotators in this exercise, when I see lateral rotation or external rotation, it's got to be concentric work. And when I see the internal rotation, that has to be eccentric work. So my concentric phase would be start to finish, lateral rotators doing lateral rotation concentrically, and then the eccentric phase would be here, there. Again, that's important for a lot of you guys clinical settings, because there may be times where you need to do manual resistance, not isometrically, but just the eccentric phases. And maybe times where you want to avoid eccentrics and you just want to do concentric phases. You have to kind of know how to identify and recognize and see. Just in class one time right here. In clinics, one of the reasons we put towels or things under the arm is because, you know, when you give someone a task and it's like, okay, bring your hand out, they don't know any better. To them, they could bring their hand out by abducting. Like you cheat when you do an exercise. If I'm doing curls and I'm standing up, what's to stop me from using my legs, right? So one of the techniques of the towel is that it keeps them from helping their functional motion, because if they do have to, how's it? So this will also be external rotators. I'm desperately trying to find you guys an internal rotation for there it is. Yes, I spoiled it, but so this one would be subscale, because the rubber band's trying to lateral, so you need muscles that are trying to medially from left to right concentric, right to left eccentric. Okay. One of the reasons why rotator cuff exercises are so prominent and important is our bodies don't. Remember when we were doing lower extremity stuff, and I talked about how some muscles live out in the country and some muscles live out in the city, and so these country muscles like pecs and glutes and quads, you grow them out, they're not going to get in the way of function. That's why most muscles turn into tendons. But tendons and certain muscles vary in their blood supply. And the reason is because we don't want them to hypertrophy too much. We don't want them to take up too much space. So your rotator cuff muscles are actually not vascularized very much because they live in the city. They live, and not only that, but like in the shoulder, like you have brachial, you have a lot of nerves and vessels and stuff coming in. So if the rotator cuff had normal vascularization like some of these country muscles, like it would take up too much space in the shoulder caps. So the way we limit, y'all know that goldfish grow as a proportion of their environment, right? So like if you keep a goldfish in a little tank, it's gonna stay a little goldfish. But if you put it in Cypress Lake, assuming it doesn't get eaten by a gator, it's gonna grow to be a bigger goldfish. And so it's kind of similar. Our bodies keep our rotator cuff muscle in a smaller tank because there's no room for them to hypertrophy inside that joint capsule. Now, the trade-off of that is they don't rehab as fast as some country living muscles that have a lot of vascularity. And in addition, if they do have a strain or a tear, that's why a lot of times you got to go in and fix it because it can't fix itself. That makes sense, okay? So some of you in the clinics or in athletics are like, man, we're always doing rotator cuff, because you kind of have to do the extra when they don't have the regular nourishment as some of those other muscles. So you got to try to stay on top of them being able to do their job. Because remember, a lot of times, guys, it's not just the muscle isn't strong enough. One of my college friends who's a PT, she used to emphasize this a long time ago. She was a softball player too. It's about fatigability. It's not about they can't do it one time. It's can they do it 1,000 times? Can they do it for 2 hours? Can they do it, right? So it's also about fatigability. So recruiting and trying to keep those muscles innervated is not just about acutely being strong enough to do their job one time. It's about them being able to maintain and do their job after you've been doing stuff for a long way. How do we stretch the subscapularis? What position would we want to put our shoulder? Okay. So we have a lot of muscles that sound similar, okay? So subscap sounds like supraspinatus. So the subscap is a internal rotation puller. So we would want to externally rotate the shoulder, right, to stretch it. So like something like this. And if we were trying to stretch the infra and teres, we'd want to internally rotate, right? So instead of something like this, you may want to do something like there's other ways to do it too, you know what I mean? Like there's so many ways to do it, but I'm just walls are great as well. Wall, you have to move your whole body, I think everybody shows on. So if you're using a wall, you're trying to externally rotate, the wall isn't gonna push you, so you have to literally kind of lean forward to create that external rotations. Any questions? Or you guys feedback, I know y'all are shy, and that's okay. Is the pace that I'm going at too boring, or do you want me to speed it up? Are we going at a good pace, or do you want me to go faster? We don't have to, we have time, but I also don't want you guys to. Good? Good pace? All right, well, feel free to leave a random anonymous note under my door if you feel different, okay? All right, you guys, you have a good one. Stay dry.